Inspirational personalities have achieved more than most. But we forget they are normal people, just like us. So we want to learn about the way they think, to understand how they have achieved greatness.
Professor Sir Simon Baron-Cohen, welcome. You have an astonishing CV, psychological researcher for over 20 years, director of the Autism Research Centre here in Cambridge, author, just to name a few. I think people will be very interested to know a little bit about your path in life and the trajectory really that led to your groundbreaking research in autism.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So you've kind of already mentioned what I do now as the director of the Autism Research Centre here in Cambridge. But where I came from, after I studied human sciences at Oxford as an undergrad, I was lucky enough to get a job as a teacher in a small unit for autistic kids. This was back in the 80s, so it's actually more than 20 years ago. And in those days, there wasn't much known about autism. And this unit was just, it's like an experimental teach school. You know, they had 6 kids. They had 6 teachers, so it was one-to-one. It was a real opportunity to get to know a small number of autistic kids in a lot of depth, because it's every day, you know, all day. And I worked there for a year as a teacher, and that's when I kind of got really fascinated by autism, trying to understand what causes it, and went on to do a PhD at UCL. And then I did clinical psychology after that, because I had in mind that I wanted my research to not just be basic science, kind of understanding causes of different phenomena, but also kind of applied research, so kind of taking the research and thinking about clinical applications. So I did a master's in clinical psychology at the Institute of Psychiatry in King's College, London, and then various lectureships since then.
And out of your huge list of achievements, which would you say that you're most proud of?
Do you mean in terms of research?
Yeah, exactly. Well, anything really. If there's something outside of research that stands out, please let us know. But
No. But when I think back about our different research projects, probably the one that I am most proud of, but also the one that was most high risk, was testing a particular hypothesis that was kind of new territory. It was the question was, you know, do prenatal hormones, particularly sex steroid hormones like testosterone and estrogen, do they play a role in the cause of autism? And it was high risk because no one had looked at it before. We had lots of clues that we thought were kind of lining up, pointing in that direction, but it was kind of a challenge to know how to test it. Partly because to look at prenatal hormones, you know, by definition, you're in a kind of, you're in a window of development where, you know, it's difficult to get close to the baby in an ethical way without doing any harm. But you want to kind of make some observations to see if it's, you know, if the evidence supports that hypothesis. So we had to find how to do it ethically. We had to find where to do it in the world that could, you know, enable such an ambitious experiment. And, you know, we had to persuade the funder, this was the Medical Research Council, to take a risk. And they did, you know, they funded it. And as it turned out, the hypothesis was supported.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how was that received by your colleagues in the research community? Was there resistance to the idea?
Yeah, I mean, I thought when I first proposed that these hormones may play a role prenatally, because hormones do lots of things to the body, including the brain, right through life, but they might have very specific functions or effects prenatally on the baby's brain. But when I first proposed it, it was kind of seen as eccentric, very left field, unlikely, and probably untestable as well, because how do you get close to the baby in a safe way? So we kind of had to solve that problem. But, you know, what's kind of gratifying now, some, I don't know, 10 years later, is that it's now mainstream. There's lots of people doing research into this area, and it's now recognized as a core factor in the cause of autism.
Wow.
So sometimes you have to kind of take a gamble,
Yeah.
and kind of go through that period where there might be lots of critics, but if you really believe in the hypothesis, find a way to test it.
Did you have any doubts? Were you shaken at all through that period?
Well, I think science. I mean, you guys know this because you're doing science. Is that right?
Yeah.
It's science. You can never guarantee the outcome of the experiment,
Mm-hmm.
and that's part of the fun of it. That you're learning whilst you're doing experiments. But if a funder or a colleague or a journalist said, "But how sure can you be that this is worth trying?" The honest answer is we don't know. The act of trying is what science is.
Right.
And would you say that particular research problem was the biggest risk that you've taken in your career?
I think scientifically.
Okay.
So when I got the reviews back from the funder, which was the MRC, Medical Research Council, the reviews said high risk, high payoff. So they also had to take a risk on our team, because it was kind of like a binary outcome. Either we would find the result, which was that there would be elevated levels of these hormones in pregnancies that later resulted in autism, or we wouldn't. It was kind of that binary. And if they're investing in that case, excuse me, in that project, it was a program grant, so there's millions going into it. But the funder themselves have to take a decision. Is it if it succeeds, was the risk worthwhile?
Was it difficult to secure that funding, and did you face any opposition from outside of funding bodies?
So I think that when I look back, that probably some projects get funded because they're safe science. There's so much evidence for the hypothesis already that it's kind of safe. It's kind of incremental science. We'll learn something, and it's just kind of building a little bit more on what we already know. And other science is slightly kind of a big leap into the dark. So I'm kind of grateful to the funder.
So I guess what drives you now, or what drove you then and now, perhaps, in your life, in your research, maybe both?
Right. So the research I do is looking at a disability, and autism is one of these kind of unusual sort of phenomena because it's part disability. These are kids and adults who struggle with social skills and with communication, but also it's something reflecting difference. These days there's a lot of talk about neurodiversity, the idea that there are many ways for the brain to develop, and there isn't a right or wrong way for the brain to develop. There are just differences, like any other form of diversity. And sometimes autism results in talent, that the way autistic people think differently and perceive the world sometimes results in them spotting things that other people miss, or taking things to a new level. Because another feature of autism is obsessive, narrow interests, taking things as far as you can. And coming back to your question, what drives that interest is kind of wanting to speak up for autistic people. So it's not just science for the sake of it. The earlier example was really just kind of what science traditionally does, which is just, advancing human knowledge for the sake of it, just so that we have a better understanding of how the world works. But sometimes science can also be, it can almost be kind of advocating for the people who you're studying, changing perceptions about autistic people. That is a big motivation for me. That rather than the old way of seeing autism, which was as a disease or a disorder, which sounds very negative, as if we're talking about cancer or something. Autism is biomedical. There's a genetic basis to it. hormonal, as we just talked about, changes in brain development. So biology is a big part of it. But there's also a person at the center of it, a person who is different. And a lot of autistic people have felt excluded from society. So instead of just looking at it from a kind of scientific lens, you can also think about autistic people as a minority who are different, who should have the same human rights as the rest of us, but many of whom have not enjoyed the same rights as everyone else. So that's kind of a, that drives me just as much as the scientific curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think society excludes these people the same way now as it did maybe perhaps when you started your career? In other words, do you see an improvement?
Yes and no. Sounds like a political answer. So I think, first of all, many more people are getting diagnosed as autistic today than it used to be the case. So when I started, it's actually 40 years ago, we thought autism was very rare, like 4 in 10,000. That's what all the textbooks said. 4 in 10,000 kids would be autistic. Today, it's like between 1% and 2%. So much more common.
Wow.
And that's probably because we weren't looking for all the cases of possible autism. Back then, our notion of autism was also not just that the person was autistic, but they also had learning difficulties, maybe language disabilities, epilepsy, a whole host of associated conditions. So we were seeing a different slice of that spectrum. And what we now recognize is that the autism spectrum is very broad, and that you can have autism without any learning disability. Elon Musk has just come out as autistic. Clearly, he doesn't have any learning disability. You can have autism with good language, So back to your question, are autistic people being excluded as much today as they were then? I'd say, sadly, probably yes. So if you look at employment rates amongst autistic people, something like 85% of autistic adults are unemployed. So that's huge. If you compare unemployment rates in any other group, it's through the roof in autistic people. So, why is that? It could be that there's a kind of explicit discrimination going on, stigma and prejudice, towards autistic applicants for jobs. Or it could be that it's not so deliberate, but it's just part of our system. That when we recruit people into jobs, we look for social skills, we look for communication skills, and those are the very areas of disability. So even without intentionally discriminating, to be like saying to someone who's in a wheelchair, you have to be able to run up the stairs. That would be kind of, for this job, for most jobs in society, you have to be able to run up the stairs. That would be kind of discriminating against someone with a physical disability. I think probably we're still doing that to autistic people. You have to be able to read between the lines, be a good team player, good at communication, read the body language. All of these sorts of things are things that autistic people find difficult.
And what about the ability to diagnose autistic people? Have you seen that change throughout your career? Is it as good as it's going to be now, or is there still room for improvement?
There's definitely room for improvement. So we've gone from it being very rare to being very common over this kind of 30 or 40 year period. The diagnosis itself has changed because back then we thought that most autistic people had learning disabilities. It was something like 75%. Today it's the absolute reverse. That 75% of autistic people do not have learning disabilities. So we were kind of diagnosing in the wrong places. We were looking in clinics or in kind of special needs schools. Whereas, now that diagnosis has been extended to the whole population, people watching this interview might think, oh, maybe I'm autistic. So different types of people are coming forward and seeking a diagnosis. And the diagnostic methods have had to adapt to, making a diagnosis of autism in someone who can function pretty well. I've worked here in the university with the Disability Resource Centre, and they've got a lot of students who either have a diagnosis of autism or are seeking one, but they've got into Cambridge to study maths or physics or computer science or engineering. Often it's those subjects, but maybe other subjects. So diagnosis is it's almost like you're looking down a microscope, but you're kind of shifting where you're looking.
And maybe perhaps switching a bit to your maybe personal side, away from your professional side, I guess, what do you think sets you apart as a researcher or in your life? In other words, what is your distinctive trait, do you think, as an advocate? Or in other words, you might call it frivolously, what is your superpower?
What I would say may set me apart is that I am willing to kind of look at hypotheses that are not necessarily politically correct, if I think that that's where the evidence is pointing. So, for example, back in the 90s, I was interested by the question as to why more boys or males were getting a diagnosis of autism. And there was a whole field in terms of the psychology of sex differences. And then there was a field in terms of the psychology of autism. And these two fields were not connecting. And I just thought we need to bring them together if we're going to understand either. We need to bring them together to see how one can inform the other. And in particular, if we look at this field of typical sex differences, which is obviously politically sensitive, might it help us understand autism? So the work I talked about earlier about looking at the prenatal sex steroid hormones all came out of this field, which had no connection to this one. So I was willing to take that risk to put the two together. And I've done that a few times across my career, is kind of making connections between things that most people would think, but those are completely unrelated. And I was kind of inspired by a professor when I was just finished my PhD. I was in London, a professor called Geoffrey Gray, who gave me the analogy that if you're a young scientist and you're trying to decide where do I focus my research interest, what he said is, if you've started over here, it's a bit like you're in a frozen lake and you've made a hole in the ice and you're going fishing over here, and then you think, what if I make a hole over here? Are these two totally separate scientific endeavors? And he said, you might be surprised that actually under the surface there's a lot of connection, and that that you're actually fishing and learning in the same pond, as it were. So that's happened several times for me, and I think sometimes science is much more cautious. That if you start just in this small, little rabbit hole, you just stay there, and you maybe venture a little bit around the sort of circumference of that hole. But you don't make a big jump and see if they're connected.
So the word that comes to mind is courage, I suppose, in your pursuits. Do you think it's as easy, not that it was easy in the beginning of your career, but do you think it's as easy to be courageous now for an early career researcher, for example, or for someone not even in research, as it was back then?
Yeah, it's really hard to know, because on the one hand, the government talks about how they're looking for innovation, so they don't just want scientists who are replicating what's been done before. Replication, I think, is really important in science. Can a different lab get the same result as somebody else? But often they say, we want innovation. We want, we want scientists who are putting in grant proposals to do what's never been done before. But on the other hand, if you take that big leap, you're going outside of the training as a scientist, which is only take one small step at a time. So it's kind of like a dilemma. And maybe that's why not too many people do that.
Or for fear of public perception.
Yeah, maybe. But if you've got a hunch, so this is kind of like my advice to, people thinking about how do I get my research funded. Put into the grant some of the safe science, like I want to repeat what's being done, go a little bit further. That's the safe science. But maybe include something that's a little bit sort of bold and ambitious. The whole grant doesn't depend on it because there's all this safe stuff. But if we don't do that, we don't make sort of big leaps forward. So,
I mean, I feel like a lot of the time in any career, people's perceptions of us are a big source of stress, whether that should be the case or not. And I was just wondering, how is it that you deal with pressure and stress?
In my personal life, I do things that are completely unrelated to my work, which I think are just important for balance. So, for example, music is really important to me. And that's my way of, like, once a week I'm in a band with friends, and music is a good way to de-stress. So whatever's going on, whether it's kind of, deadlines at work or difficult problems to solve in any part of my life, I find music is a good kind of counterbalance.
And what's your instrument of choice?
I play bass guitar.
Okay.
But it's more about sort of, music is, I think it's, talking about superpowers, I think music has the power to allow you to express feelings that you can't necessarily do in other ways. Music can also bring people together, which I think is really a kind of nice kind of social dimension to music. And when you're playing with friends, you end up producing something that no one individual could do on their own. And that's really quite special too.
Yeah, it's a synergistic process.
Definitely. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, because there are other things that you do in your work which are entirely down to you. So if you're writing a book, for example, that's quite a solitary kind of activity. Or if you're kind of doing your own research, that can be quite solitary. You can take the credit, you can also take the criticism, but it's kind of a solitary activity. There are other things, of course, which are very much done in teams, in science particularly these days. And that's very satisfying when the whole team gets the result that no one could do alone. And music is a bit like that, but it's non-verbal. You kind of decide what the song is going to be, and you're all listening for your part, and then you put it all together. And that's quite special.
What do you think you would be if not for a scientist? Would it be a musician?
No, I mean, music for me is kind of, it's a way to connect with friends. I'm not, I was never kind of motivated to do that professionally. It's just a fun way to relax and to enjoy relationships, sometimes without talking, I think, personally, a big motivator for me has probably been in my family, that I grew up in a family where my sister had profound learning difficulties. So she was the next one in the family. So when I was 2 years old, she was born with really quite severe learning disabilities and physical disabilities. And, I'm sure that she kind of inspired me in some way to do the work that I do. But if I wasn't doing research, I imagine, that the way we're programmed by our early experience, I would probably be doing something in a related aspect of disability.
I would try to be a professional soccer player, or football player as you call it here, but that didn't work out, and I don't think it will ever, maybe in another life.
So on to the serious questions now. What three things would you take with you on a one-way trip to Mars?
All right. Does it have to be a one-way trip?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
Right. So I know that Elon Musk has, now made it possible that a vehicle can go to Mars. Mm-hmm. What would I take? Is there a way to power up a coffee machine on Mars? Because I might want to take my solar power. Okay.
Make it happen.
Okay, so I might need to take my DeLonghi coffee maker.
Very serious.
Yeah. Maybe a guitar. I don't know how acoustics works on Mars, but music would be kind of difficult to live without. And maybe some way of writing, because I do actually really enjoy writing. So whether it's a laptop or whether it's just a pen and paper, old school, I think there is a kind of pleasure in kind of formulating your ideas, thinking about your ideas and putting them down and playing with them on a page.
Yeah, I agree. I guess maybe lastly, what is the most important lesson you've learned in your life and that you would wish to share with others?
Most important lesson. I mean, I think, a lot of the projects that I've been involved in my career have involved risk. We've talked a little bit about that. But if you're kind of really interested in the question or in the project, even if there are all kinds of obstacles that stand in your way, I would say just follow your passion. I know it's a kind of cliche, but if you're really motivated to do it, you should just do it. Find a way to do it. Don't give up, kind of thing.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
It's all right.